Hello, this time on Sitrep. Will the war between Russia and Ukraine be decided by attrition, by which side simply gets completely worn down first? Simon Newton is in Ukraine for us once again, assessing not just how military capability is holding up, but also hearing how the nation's all-important resolve is doing.
Probably Ukraine will have to wage this war for a long time. We don't know for how long. We don't know with which resources, because Ukrainian is dependent on the resources that will be provided or will not be provided by the partners.
Those partners have just agreed to something Ukraine's wanted since the very start: permission to strike deep into Russia with Western missiles.
Russia is preparing for this huge counterattack into Kursk with over 50,000 soldiers. All their forming up points and start points that they're in now are in range of Atacms and Storm Shadow.
But can it be the game changer they hope for? And if not that, then what else might determine the outcome of this war?
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
More than 1,000 days have now passed since Russia began its full-scale war with Ukraine. It is just a number. There are others that are more meaningful. 1 million people have been killed or wounded in those 1,000 days. The Norwegian Refugee Council says the rate of civilian casualties reached its highest yet over the summer. On the battlefield, destruction of Russian military hardware reached record levels last month. On one day, it lost more than 200 pieces, including tanks and aircraft. But the Ukrainians are suffering big losses too. More than 50 of important pieces of their military hardware were destroyed on the same day. Mike, those numbers paint a picture of a war which Russia expected to win in 10 days, now entrenched in a war of attrition.
Yeah, I mean, war has its own dynamic, Kate, as we always know and we've discussed many times. And in a way, this began as a military-backed coup in February 2022. The Russians were going to seize Ukraine in a coup that was backed by the military, but not that many military, less than 200,000 troops to take over a country of 44 million people. It then became a war of attrition as the Russians doubled down on the fact that they were not going to withdraw, they were not going to stop. Putin was in this for the long term and he would pay whatever price had to be paid, and that's where we find ourselves now. And it's become more than a war of attrition. Now it's become an era-defining war between the countries that want to smash the Western system with the international law that goes with it and the influence of the Western powers, and the Western powers who are only just waking up to the fact that this war is probably the most strategically important struggle of certainly of the 21st century, but since 1945. And that's where we are now. Sadly, this war is about much more than Ukraine, which is why the Russians will do whatever it takes, and it's not quite clear yet whether the West will do whatever it takes or whether we're going to try to manage our way out of it and find that actually the whole thing has turned against our interests around the world.
You know, it's absolutely staggering when you hear you sum it up like that, as it is at the moment. Some more numbers. The UK has pledged more than £12 billion so far in assistance to Ukraine, and we've trained 50,000 troops. I say that not to make it big us up, as it were, but those numbers signal how important the outcome of this is to us. It has the potential to decide whether or not we end up at war with Russia, and that outcome currently appears to rest on who can keep going the longest.
Yes, the whole point of the war is that this is the return of industrial age war to Europe. We thought we'd seen the last of it with the Second World War, but industrial age war is determined by the mobilization of resources and the ability to deploy them to a battlefront. And so, in a sense, it's not necessarily total war, but it does mean that the side that will prevail, whatever that means, and it means different things, of course, but the side that will prevail is the side that can mobilize its industrial capacity. And in that contest, on paper, the West should find that relatively easy to do over Russia. But it doesn't find that easy to do because it hasn't really taken on the challenge, whereas Putin, who is unrivaled in his control over the Russian economy, has taken on the challenge 100%.
Well, we'll talk more about that war of attrition and the potential outcomes in a bit. But to inform that, let's just get a sense of the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now and how it's developed. So let's go to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and Sitrep's Simon Newton. Hello, Simon. How is it there?
Okay. It's been a very interesting few days here. Obviously, this has been the 1,000th day of this current conflict this week, which is maybe more of a benchmark for us news people than it is for the people who are actually living here. I mean, you talk to them and they'll really stress that this conflict began 10 years ago when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. But we've in the past few days had a sort of step up in air raids overnight, one of them lasting about 11 hours or so. Shahed drones have been flying here towards Kyiv, and some ballistic missiles. Obviously, it's worse elsewhere in this country, in regions like Sumy, where they've had, I think, about 11 people killed there. In Odessa, there was 10 people killed, including some children, I believe. So they are shooting down a lot of those drones. On Tuesday this week, they shot down, I think, about 56 Shahed drones overnight. But the big story here this week also has been, of course, this closure of the US embassy, with the Americans saying that they had some intelligence that showed there was a significant potential threat of a Russian airstrike on that facility, obviously off the back of this decision by America to grant permission to use long-range Atacms missiles inside Russia itself. And then we saw the Spanish, the Greeks and the Italians follow suit, also closing their embassies here in Kyiv. So it's been a very interesting few days.
And how does it compare to when you visited there a year ago?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I think there's definitely more of an air raid threat here than there was 12 months ago. I think back then we had one very big strike one particular night, but out of a 7-day period, for instance, that was the only real one we had. Whereas in the past few days, we've had them every day and every night. One this afternoon, just lasting a couple of hours. In terms of the mood, I think the resilience is still there, definitely amongst the people that you speak to. I sense perhaps a little bit more gloom in the mood of the people that we've been speaking to. They are trying to get on with their lives. There's the same level of resilience, but the stress of going through this for that extra year I think is telling definitely on people. We spoke to one young woman here in the centre of Kyiv yesterday, just doing some interviews, and she broke down in tears when we were asked about the experience of living through this war.
The first thing I can say is that everyone else in the world outside Ukraine, they don't understand what we are facing in our regular daily life. Our cities are destroyed and totally scratched off the surface of the earth. People are being killed all the time, and all this horrible stuff, it's not clear and open to the rest of the world. Those who aren't losing their close relatives will never understand the price we are paying. Every day we walk through the centre of the city and see people without their legs, without their hands. The rest of the world are not doing as much as they need to. We still need so much help.
And just talking about the daily impact of seeing constant air raids and this total uncertainty about what's going to happen next with their lives, and this feeling that they've been kind of forgotten by many around the world, that they just need more help to try and win this war.
Simon, on day one of this full-scale war, the very visible determination and resolve of Ukraine's people, from President Zelensky at the top down to the man or woman on the street, was identified by many as the key to the outcome of the war. More than 1,000 days on, is that resolve intact, or is it suffering attrition?
This isn't precise or scientific, but the Ukrainians you talk to, there is no sign of that resolve slipping or weakening. In fact, almost the opposite. They're seeing the destruction of their cities. They're seeing the execution of POWs by the Russians, the stories from occupied areas like Mariupol, and that really has just strengthened what I think it's not even it's a hatred of the Russians. And we spoke to an injured soldier yesterday here in Kyiv who was telling us if he had to, they would fight the Russians with shovels and axes. That there is no doubt in their mind that victory will come their way.
Mike, Simon paints a very vivid picture there of how the war is playing out in Kyiv right now, but that's hundreds of miles from the front line. How fierce is the fighting right now? Because we've talked many times before about how boggy ground at this time of year can slow things down, but then an impending winter freeze opens up new opportunities for both sides to potentially push forward.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't done that yet because the freeze hasn't started, so we're in the boggy phase at the moment, where it's pretty wet all the way around. And we know that the fighting has been fairly fierce down in Pokrovsk and towards Chasiv Yar, down in the southern part of that big semicircle on the map that we always see. In a way, the fighting's it is fierce on the ground, but it's at its most basic because it's small groups of men, Russians, or people fighting for Russia, going forward in squads of sometimes 2s and 3s and then 8s and 10s, constantly just trying to take another few yards, and a lot of them get killed. They're suffering at least 1,200, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 casualties a day, which is dead or seriously wounded. And they keep on doing it. They're just putting men into this meat grinder. And the problem for the Ukrainians is that they're running out of ammunition and they're very short of sleep. But I don't think there'll be a big breakthrough. The Russians are just grinding forward very slowly, very, very expensively. And they're hoping that at some point, Ukrainian morale will finally break. But I don't think it will, not for a little while yet. The biggest problem for Ukrainian morale is what they see in the outside world. If they think the outside world is turning their backs on them, then I think their morale may really suffer. But as Simon was saying, they are absolutely determined to fight. And if they got more help, they would fight with much better heart.
Indeed. Let's just step back and look at the big picture. And I'm going to roll out some more numbers now. The Institute for the Study of War says Russia has taken around 1,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory this year. That's 6 times what it took last year. On the one hand, that suggests Russia may be moving beyond attrition. But we also know it's not just how much, it's where that also matters, where it is that also matters.
Yeah, and in a way that figure is a little bit artificial because on last year the Russians were sort of on the back foot. So they didn't take any territory. Now they're taking some territory. So, yeah, it's 6 times more than they took last year, from a very low base. I mean, what the Russians are trying to do is take the whole of the Donbass region. And so they began this war with control of about 1/3 of it. They've now got control of 2/3 of it, and they're trying to take the other 1/3. That's really what it comes down to. And if they keep on grinding forward in this way, then they might be able to do that. Let's say if the fighting continued to the spring and the Ukrainians don't get any more help, that is possible. They take the whole of the Donbass. And then they have ambitions, it seems, to push into Zaporizhia, to the west of the Donbass, which they control some of already from the south, and take the rest of that. That's probably their maximum territorial ambition if the fighting goes on at this level for, say, another 12 months. That's probably as much as they can do. But they still hold out the hope that somehow there'll be a settlement, there'll be a deal which will give them things that they don't already possess, or that somehow Ukraine will just collapse in front of them and they'll walk into the whole of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. That's what they would really like at the moment, to take that 30-40% of Ukraine that is on the eastern side of the great Dnieper River.
And of course, Ukraine has taken Russian territory in Kursk, around 500 square miles initially, it said. Although it's lost around half of that now. Is that an important factor in the war at this point, given Ukraine's one strategic goal is to get back its own territory?
Yeah, they're holding on to just over half of what they originally took in Kursk. But again, the Russian counteroffensive has stalled. And the Ukrainians are doing better now because they're getting more equipment into Kursk. So it's important that they hold off for them, that they hold on to a chunk of Kursk. They had quite a big chunk after their offensive in August, and they've now got enough still as a bargaining chip if that's what it becomes. So as long as they hold on to what they've got now, then I think that's a significant bargaining chip. And we know that Putin had ordered that Kursk be retaken quickly, and it wasn't. And then he had ordered that it be retaken by the beginning of October, and it wasn't. And he's ordered that it be taken before the 20th of January or before Trump becomes president, when they may well go in for some sort of negotiation. He's very anxious that Kursk is not still in Ukraine's possession at some point when he makes his demands, which he will do. And the Ukrainians are equally determined that they will hold on to a significant chunk of Kursk at that point. So they'll try to keep it over the winter, and I think they've got a reasonable chance of doing that if they still are prepared to put the resources in, which they have so far. But they're outnumbered at least 2 to 1. They've got, we think, about 20,000, maybe 25,000 troops in Kursk. The Russians and the North Koreans between them, we now know, number at least 50,000, and there may be more. So the Ukrainians are facing, a difficult task, but they seem to want to carry on doing it.
You've been pretty much dedicated, Simon, to covering this war for 2 years now. I spoke at the start about it being entrenched as a war of attrition. What's your assessment? Is it solely that right now, or does either side have an advantage and some momentum?
I think if military analysts, if you look at it, will say the Russians have a military momentum at the moment. They are gradually taking these settlements along the eastern front. They're inching towards this key town of Pokrovsk, this key logistics hub for the Ukrainian military. And if I read Russian mill bloggers' posts, and they talk about the fact that the Russian army particularly wants to move out of open field fighting, which is where they've been most vulnerable throughout this war, into almost urban warfare, really, back into populated areas over this particular winter, this 24-25 winter. So we're talking about places like Pokrovsk, like Toretsk, like Kurakovi. But of course, no one knows exactly what the effect is going to be of this decision by the Americans to grant the permission for long-range Atacms and other missiles into Russia. And obviously, following on from that, we now know that British missiles have also been used. We've seen footage emerged of those missiles being used against targets inside Kursk. And there's some quite dramatic footage of a series of what are believed to be Storm Shadow missiles, British missiles hitting targets inside that Kursk region. So the momentum is with Russia for now. But there are these many unknowns. Moscow's military production is slowing down. There's a thought that next year, they won't be able to keep replenishing their stocks at the rate at which they're using them. So there's a thought that, if Ukraine can hang on, if it's supplied and it's kept going into the spring, we can see what's going to happen with Donald Trump's arrival, that things could potentially turn in their favor, sometime towards the middle of next year.
And Simon, you've been talking to someone in particular who's been following the war there very closely from a professional, analytical point of view. Tell me about your conversation with them, and maybe we can hear from it as well.
Well, yeah, we've been talking to a journalist with Radio Free Europe called Roman Paleolic, who covers defence for that channel, and he particularly goes to the Donbass region of Ukraine, which is obviously where a lot of the fighting has been going on recently and for some time, and obviously that's been occupied by Russia since 2014. He's in Kyiv right now, and we met him actually in the main park here in Kyiv, one which actually was hit by an airstrike at the very beginning of the war. And I asked him really to tell me more about what he's seen on those frontline areas that he's been to recently.
People are tired. Even if they don't talk about that, we can see that in their eyes, because people have to sleep, not really a lot of work, and we know that Ukrainian army lacks people. Not only equipment, shells, but also people, and it's possibly the first priority for Ukrainian army. So, yes, it's the main change. Possibly motivation. It's hard to give one estimate, because Ukrainian forces are like nearly 1 million people. So it's also a society where we can meet really different people. Some appeared in army because they were mobilized and didn't really want it. Some joined the war in 2022. Some just witnessed something that traumatized them. It's really hard to talk about it. But still, people want to fight.
So if you go to the front line now, do the guys you meet there, do they have enough do they have enough weapons, do they have small arms, do they have uniforms, food, the things that soldiers need to fight at this particular moment in time? Do they have enough of that stuff?
I think in terms of uniform, in terms of stuff that ordinary infantry guy, ordinary soldier has to carry, it's enough, even if it's summer or if it's winter, it's enough. in terms, if you want to make your equipment better, yeah, people buying something that Ukraine cannot provide as a state. It's a complicated question because in terms of, for example, artillery shells, it won't be enough anytime. The huge problem for guys who is waging war in trenches, it may sound weirdly, but they need machine guns, they need mortars, they need grenade launchers. So this basically it's not really, it doesn't cost a lot, but still it's a big problem because Ukraine needs a lot of that because the front line is more than 1,000 kilometers long. Small arms, small weapons, collective infantry weapons, I may call it. It's a big issue that would make Ukrainian battle easier. For example, we were in Chasiv Yar, and when we were there, the crew of automatic grenade launcher, in the US it's MK90 if I'm not mistaken. They brought it to the command post because drones threw a grenade in it, and they have to change this machine on another, so it's a daily routine.
I mean, you mentioned drones and you've been to the front line. How much of a psychological effect is that fear of the FPV drone above them all the time?
It's a big problem. For example, when we were in Chasiv Yar, we just tried to move closer to something that can us protect for near the building, near the tree, etc. Because you don't really know whose drone is. You just hear this buzzing and try to hide. And you also don't really know, is it a reconnaissance drone, just a quadrocopter, or it's FPV? Yeah, possibly you can hear when the FPV drone is buzzing, like it's weighted with something, that it has lifted some, I don't know, grenade or etc. You just hear it because the sound is different. It's really a big problem, and one infantryman who at that moment was in Chasiv Yar, he was just expecting for night time to move to his position. He told me that it's hard to predict how many drones will be during your shift, but for example he experienced one day when his trench or hideout had almost 50 drones. He did it during one day, and he said he had such a big headache after that. But yeah, it's reality.
Let me ask just about the country as a whole, because I think one of the strengths, they say, Ukraine's morale is the key to its success in this war. President Zelensky talks about it all the time, and it's a very interesting moment now here. You've got Trump coming, you've got North Korean troops in Kursk, you've got all these things going on at once. Putin changes the nuclear doctrine. How is this country feeling about this moment? I mean, you said it's obviously apprehension about what's coming next in January when Trump arrives.
I think everyone has his own view on this situation. I think the similar feeling that possibly a lot of people here in Ukraine has, it's uncertainty. What will happen after a new president takes office in the White House? I don't know. After almost 3 years of a full-scale invasion, it's hard to build any predictions. We just live this war here in Kyiv, and that's all. Because you don't have to worry all the time, because your mental health also precious, and I don't know. It's not a reason to sit down and do nothing. Probably Ukraine will have to wage this war for a long time. We don't know for how long. We don't know with which resources, because Ukrainian is dependent on the resources that will be provided or will not be provided by the partners. So it's life of Ukrainian people, and we have only one of that. there is, a discussion inside Ukrainian society about how long Ukraine is waging war with Russia, because when, for example, in my social media, when some people and Ukrainian officials write about 1,000 days of war with Russia, some people that are involved in this process from the time of Donbass, from Crimea annexation time, they correct these people and say that truly Ukraine wages war for 3,927 days. It's from the time when annexation of Crimea happened. So it's different approaches, and probably for Ukraine, for Ukrainian policy that is made publicly, that Ukraine wants to have its borders back, its sovereignty back, and independence. It's important because Crimea also part of Ukraine as the current occupied regions like Donetsk, Luhansk, etc. For people, it's only one question, I think. Do you support the fight or not? And it's the most important also in terms of support of Ukraine.
And one thing I also talked to him about was this, some very dramatic footage he showed me, that he was actually talking to a drone unit in a forest in Crimea, which is near Bakhmut, back in October, when a Russian shell landed about 3 meters away from where he was standing. Remarkably, he and the guys that he was with managed to survive, but he still suffers with inner ear problems. And the footage he showed me was actually incredible. And you've got a real sense from this footage of just how active and dangerous that part of the front line is.
Simon, thank you for now, but stay with us and we'll talk a bit more shortly.
Thank you.
Mike, it was really interesting, if not surprising, hearing Roman saying to Simon how tired and drained the troops at the front line appear to be, but also that there simply aren't enough. How badly has Ukraine suffered attrition to the people part of its forces, and how long can it maintain that all-important human capability?
Yeah, Kate, I mean, the long-term projections are not particularly good, because Ukraine is a country of 44 million people, but it's only now got 33 million people to whom it has access, because the Russians have got 20% of the territory. So it's got 33 million people from whom it can draw. It mobilized people from the age of 27, not the younger people, but from 27 onwards, because it took the view that older people should fight on the front lines and the young people are the lifeblood of society. It had a big issue in reducing that to 25, but interestingly, I mean, we would look to our 18 to 25-year-olds who are younger and fitter and perhaps more gung-ho, however you want to put it. We'd look to them as the front line of our forces, but not Ukraine. So they do have a problem in deciding, are they really going to mobilize the 33 million population that they've got fully to this war? But equally, see, the Russians have got a problem, because although Russia is 145 million people, as against 33 million people in Ukraine, the Russians are having trouble mobilizing as well. They're trying to get everybody in on a voluntary basis, because partial mobilization was very unpopular when Putin introduced it a couple of years ago. But they're recruiting fewer than 1,000 people a day, and they're losing more than 1,000 people a day. So even by paying huge amounts of money to people to join the army, particularly people from Siberia and the east of Russia, and a lot of foreign fighters are coming in now just for the money, even with that, they're still recruiting fewer than they're losing. So the Russians have got a problem as well. But over the longest term, then the Russians are in a better position to sustain a 10-year war than Ukraine is, just in terms of sheer people power.
And Mike, when you were giving a talk at the Royal United Services Institute this week about great British commanders and history, you were talking about, I think it was the 100 Years' War, where England spent most of the time winning the battles and winning the territory, but ultimately lost the war because it was a smaller country with fewer resources and people. Ukraine has a quarter of the population of Russia. Its economy is 1/10 the size of Russia's. Based on what you said the other night, does history tell us that Ukraine can't win if this remains a war of attrition?
Depends how long it goes. What I was saying about the 100 Years' War is that you can keep winning military battles, but it's like punching a sponge. You can keep winning battles against a big country. Now, that's not quite the same here, because it's not as if Ukraine is trying to invade Russia. It's not trying to take Russia over, which is what England was trying to do to France during the 100 Years' War. So the Ukrainians are looking for enough of a victory to get the Russians to go home. So that's not implausible. That can happen. It's not quite the same sort of balance of forces. But between a big country and a small country, if a war goes on for long enough, and by long enough I mean decades rather than years, then you would expect the big country to prevail. And in Putin's thinking, he's prepared to go for decades if necessary. Of course, he won't be there then, because he's 72, 73 now already. So he's on a timetable of, let's say, the next 10 years, where he intends to establish himself in Russian history alongside Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and Joseph Stalin. That's what he wants. The Ukrainians, in a way, have got to be able to fight, in my view, for the rest of the decade. And the Western world has got to be prepared to support them, in principle, at more than current levels for the rest of the decade. And then we'll see where we are.
And of course, both sides will want a tipping point that puts them on a path to victory, although things are never quite that simple. But I want to take a moment to assess a couple of notable developments this week and how significant they might be as change makers in this war. Let's start with the authorization by the US for Ukraine to strike into Russian territory with longer-range Atacms missiles that it has supplied. It appears, as Simon mentioned earlier, that UK-supplied Storm Shadow missiles are also now being fired into Russia. There are contrasting views on how significant a difference they might make. We'll hear first from retired Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who believes this could have an existential impact on Russian operations. And then John Foreman, former military attaché to both Moscow and Kyiv, who is less optimistic.
Storm Shadow, a long-range missile launched from a fighter jet. Its marginal advantage is that it's incredibly accurate and can do a lot of damage at target end. I think also importantly, it would appear that the Russians have very great difficulty in trying to interdict this missile because of the speed it's going and also the way that it actually attacks its target. It can then probably reach a good sort of 300 kilometers into Russia. Now, this is significant because this is where most of the Russian airfields, most of the Russian missile sites where they fire the Iskander missiles and other hypersonic missiles into Ukraine are based, where the military command and control, the further back you go, the higher level of command and control there is. And I think one of the qualities of Storm Shadow is actually being a two-stage warhead. It can burrow quite deep underground, and the assumption that the key Russian command and control nodes will be deep underground, reinforced concrete, etc., then that is no deterrence to Storm Shadow.
I think the decision by the Americans to give approval for Atacms and perhaps the UK for approval for Storm Shadow, I think it's a limited step. I think it's been a long time coming, but I think the problem is that the numbers, I think, of the missiles are likely to be limited, and I think Russia's moved an awful lot of its military capability out of range. Now, there are an awful lot of targets inside the Atacms range: barracks, ammunition dumps, logistics sites, bridges, that sort of thing, which can affect military operations of Russia launching inside Ukraine. But I think we need to see more the exact range of where Americans have given approval. I think the Russians have become quite adept at dispersing. Obviously, they've been under attack from the Ukrainians for 2.5 years inside Ukraine, and they have adapted their tactics. I think the comments by the National Security Advisor, the Americans, Jake Sullivan, when he specifically mentioned the North Korean troops, was an indicator which was behind some of the American calculations that inclusion of a foreign army in the war is not desirable, and they're trying to tell the Russians this is a step too far. So I think I heard Kirk Volker, who used to work in NATO as US ambassador, say this is likely to be a slowing down or complication for the Russians. I don't think it's going to be a serious reversal, certainly not existential as far as I see it.
Mike, what do you think? Could this approval of deep strike from Ukraine into Russia prove to be a tipping point?
I don't think it'll be a military tipping point. I mean, I'm closer to John Foreman on this view, I think. It may help the Ukrainians hold on to Kursk for longer, if they use them mainly in Kursk, which I think they may well do. I must admit, if I had control of it, my inclination would be to make the life of the North Koreans as uncomfortable as possible, to make sure that this experiment in sending 10,000 North Koreans to see how they get on, with a view to maybe sending 100,000 soon, I think the Ukrainians will want that experiment to manifestly fail and be very expensive and very painful. So if it was me, I'd use them against the effectiveness of the North Korean forces. So I think it may well help Ukraine in Kursk. But I think, as John Foreman says, the numbers are critical here. Storm Shadow, there's not that many. They've probably got a couple of hundred that we've been able to give them, and maybe a couple of hundred, maybe more, Scalp, the French version. But, I mean, they need several thousand of these things to make any real difference. So, yes, they'll be helpful, and it may slow down Russia's advance because it can hit the rear areas, and it can take out, as Hamish said, command and control centres deep underground. So its bunker-busting properties are very important. But tipping point, no, it won't be that. It might have been a tipping point if it had happened 6 or 8 months ago, but there you are. It's always the way that the West gives aid when it's too little, too late to make the sort of differences that the technology would have provided.
The Biden administration has greenlit, though, Ukraine to use a specific type of anti-personnel mine, but that's not a game changer, is it?
No, again, it helps because the Ukrainians need to be able to slow down the rate at which the Russians are advancing over open country. As Simon was saying, I mean, the Russians have been in open country fighting, which they don't like at all. And anti-personnel landmines can actually slow down particularly dismounted forces who are just trying to advance over territory. Again, there's always ways around dealing with mines, but because it slows you down, because it canalizes an attack, it actually creates lines through which troops have got to go, so you can, sort of free lanes, as it were, mine-free lanes. You can actually target the lanes. So it complicates life for the attacker if there's lots of anti-personnel landmines. And those anti-personnel landmines now that the Americans are talking about are ones that effectively self-destruct after a while, or at least they go out of commission. So they're not there forever in the way that the 100 million or more landmines around the world are blowing children's legs off every day of the year somewhere in the world. That's not the case with what the Americans are supplying. They last for a while, and so they're a reasonable military asset which will help. They'll help the Ukrainians, and again, they needed lots of them a year ago.
Another big development, President Putin's new doctrine on nuclear weapons, lowering the threshold for their use. He'd said months ago it was coming. Clearly, particularly with the timing, it's meant to eat away at Western support for Ukraine. Will it?
It may have some effect. The timing of the announcement when he signed the decree was very carefully calculated to be the day after America allowed the use of Atacms missiles. So it was always set up to do that. And what it says is that we now regard ourselves as in a nuclear confrontation with America. And now, after Storm Shadow and Scalp, also with the United Kingdom and with France. It won't make any practical difference because what Putin is saying is he sees himself as in a nuclear confrontation with three powers, all of whom have their own independent nuclear deterrents. But what he's trying to do is to keep the word nuclear in the news in Western countries. And although in Britain we tend to smile, and I mean, Downing Street issued a very strong statement immediately after this announcement of the doctrine change and called it ridiculous. I mean, just Downing Street almost laughed at it in an official statement. But it has an effect in Germany. The Germans constantly worry about nuclear issues. So saber rattling on the nuclear side does have some effect on the Allies. And that's why Putin does it, to make sure that people like you and I keep on talking about it.
Well, let's go back to Simon in Ukraine. Simon, we said it before, but it bears repeating. Ukraine is not just relying on allies like the UK and US to supply military hardware. It's making its own. President Zelensky marked 1,000 days of all-out war with a resilience plan, which included producing at least 30,000 long-range drones next year. The problem is attrition from Russian attacks not only affects military capability right now, it makes it all the harder for Ukraine to regenerate the capability.
Yeah, I mean, I think the feeling you get from talking to them is that they feel almost, I don't know, they've been given obviously a lot of military hardware, is they actually haven't been given enough to show what they can achieve if they're actually properly resourced. They are desperately trying to build this sovereign defence industry, which they hope will be capable of filling the gap should America draw down its supplies of weaponry and aid, or even the European allies decide that they're going to start doing the same. So, Ukraine has already produced, I think it's 2.5 million mortar and artillery rounds just this year alone. So it is hugely stepping up its production. But there is a feeling they could really build that industrial base far, far bigger. But again, they just need more support.
And Simon, you're not out there alone. Hannah is with you. You're working with BFBS Forces News colleague, Hannah King. Can we have a quick chat with Hannah, if you wouldn't mind just swapping seats for a second and then coming back at the end, if that's all right?
Of course.
And here she comes.
Don't move my head.
Hi, Hannah. Really great to see you.
Hello.
This is your first time in Ukraine, and you've seen a lot of the world up to now. Like all of us here, you've been following this war from a distance for 1,000 days. I just wonder how the reality compares with what you expected.
I didn't know what to expect, if I'm honest. I think all the way through sort of following coverage of this war, I think I've been fascinated by just the total mix of the old and the new. So modern day warfare with stuff that could have been World War II. So, you've got kind of cutting edge drones and missiles, and then you've got people fighting in trenches and being evacuated on trains, and, scenes that are more reminiscent of the Second World War. That has been what has fascinated me. And I think that's just followed through when we've got here. Just as an example, the air raids that we've been experiencing here, you've got the siren that rings out across the city, and it sounds exactly like I imagine what it was like in the Blitz. But then everyone's got the app on their smartphone, that does sort of an electronic air raid siren. And so you all trundle off kind of down into to the nearest shelter, which for us is the car park in the hotel, clutching your pillow, and you try and get some sleep. And then, a couple of hours later, it's over, and everyone's app starts alerting them. The guy in the bed next door, and everyone's got got it set to their preferences. So his goes off going, air raid over, may the force be with you, and everyone trundles back up above ground and things like that. It's just quite surreal. But I think also what surprised me was just things like that are so normal, have become so normal. This part of life, everyone's just cracking on. They have their timetable with all the outages, the power outages that they're, that are timed for that day, depending on where they are in the city and things like this. But, and like I say, everyone's just getting on with life. But like Simon mentioned, then you speak to young ladies in the street, like for Luke that we spoke to yesterday, and you realise, they outwardly, they're all just getting on with life. It all seems very normal, but there's so much hurt, and there's so much pain, and there's so many people here have lost people. I just, at the end of that interview, I just said, I'm so sorry what's happened. I just want to give you a big hug. And she came right in, and I was just like, it was,
yeah. And that conversation that you had with Luke, I mean, she's very firmly of the view that those of us outside really don't understand without experiencing it. What do you think the most significant thing, or one thing that you've learned that would help us understand what she wants us to know?
Well, she sort of said herself, the rest of the world aren't losing friends, relatives, partners, on a daily basis. But everybody here knows someone that's either been wounded or lost in the war. And I think her point was just, unless you lose somebody in a conflict, the rest of the world can't really know. But just by her kind of talking to us, and I was so, glad that she carried on. Often people break down, they just want to stop there, and she didn't. She carried on, and she didn't say it, but I think she probably just wanted to make sure that people, maybe that would help people understand what they're going through.
I'm really grateful that we've had the opportunity to have a conversation this long, actually, Hannah, because, you know, with you were saying how many warnings there were for potential air raids. And I was just challenging to work there, but also challenging to get there. What was the journey like?
Oh, yeah, that was quite interesting. I mean, Simon did warn me it was quite atmospheric. So obviously you need to go over land. The way in is to go by sleeper from the border. And it is atmospheric, and it's very strange. So you get there late at night, and it's, you know, it's freezing, it's foggy, it's you know, you're standing in a queue, a lot of women and children there, and you're sort of looking around, thinking, what's everyone's story? Where are you going? We actually chatted to a young man, I think he was about 26, called Alan, and he was Swedish, and he was going to fight with the Foreign Legion. It was his second.
And you're travelling by train, right, Hannah?
Traveling by train, yeah, sleeper train overnight. Yeah. So leaves about 9 o'clock in the evening, and so I mean it. Like I say, it's just sort of so atmospheric. You get on this old rickety sleeper train, and, you know, they come around with the sniffer dogs and they take everyone's passport, and it's and you get going and you lie there and it's kind of creaking away, and, you know, the sort of you listen to the rhythm on the track, and it screeches as it slows down to go through the stations, and then you wake up in, you know, a country in Europe that's been fighting to defend itself for 1,000 days, and it's just surreal. I can't really explain it.
Hannah, really good to talk to you. Thank you for swapping seats with Simon. Would you mind just sort of making space for him to come back? Yeah. And we'll just finish up. I hope the rest of the trip goes all right. Thank you so much. So, Simon, the temptation is to ask you where this is all going and how it's all going to end, but it is a bit trite, isn't it? Is there anything other than uncertainty there at the moment?
I think probably not, to be honest with you. I think there's this massive uncertainty about the immediate future, about Trump, about military aid, but they don't seem to have any uncertainty about the outcome of the war longer term. As I mentioned, you know, that veteran we talked to, you know, and one of the strange things, you ask people in Kyiv, what plans have you got if this all goes wrong? You know, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? And they say, well, I don't really have any plans. I won't be staying, but I don't know quite where I'm going to go. And you just walk around the city looking at all of these people thinking, what is, you know, how do they exist in this kind of, like, it's a kind of waiting game to see. But I think that's partly because they're just completely convinced that they will win this war. And perhaps that's naivety, I don't know, but they absolutely believe it. And I guess if you were in their shoes living this life day to day, the kind of impression you get is that you would probably think exactly the same way.
Simon, really good to speak to you and Hannah, and look forward to seeing the rest of your work from your time out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mike, a final thought. I could ask if we'll be having this conversation again in another 1,000 days, but I fear it would just be guesswork. So instead, if we go back to what you often say about history, it doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I wonder if history offers us any idea about what is going to determine the how and the when for the end of this war.
No, only that it's the trends are that the antagonism will be a very long antagonism until, or unless Russia changes its view, and that'll go beyond Putin probably, its view being that Ukraine has no right to exist. And for as long as the Russians think that, then Ukraine will be in a state of antagonism, which will probably go between, as we're active fighting and then an armed peace and then perhaps more active fighting. But in terms of, you know, I spend a long time trying to look and think and write about the great sweeps of history. And one of the things about the sweeps of history is that the unexpected always happens. You can't predict what it's going to be, but you know, nobody expected the Cold War to come to an end quite so suddenly as it did. Nobody expected the world to turn around, the attacks on 9/11. There's constant things that run across the trend lines, and although the trend lines look all pretty bleak at the moment from the point of view of the democratic world, a couple of things I think come right out from these reports that we've had today. I mean, Roman said, you know, you just have to live in the moment. When you live in a war, you live in the moment. And sometimes you just have to stand up for what is right. It's as simple as that. And that goes for those who are in the front line, as you and I are not, and those of us here who are trying to support it in different ways. And I thought Hannah's points were really poignant, because in the midst of all of this, in the midst of history going darker and darker, young people will still fall in love. They will still have beautiful children. And you hold on to that because that's the core of what history is really all about.
Mike, thank you so much, and thanks to all of our guests. It's not quite all for now, because Professor Michael Clarke and I have an extra edition of Sitrep online for you now. It's talking through the Defence Secretary's announcement, retiring 6 military capabilities that he calls outdated. We explain what they are and what it means for Britain's armed forces. And of course, we'll be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye for now.